Hello, you're watching Avenue X, and today let's talk about this very popular character, Ne Zha. On January 29th, 2025, the first day of Chinese New Year, a movie got released in China's movie theaters as the sequel to the 2019 animation Ne Zha, Ne Zha 2. Its specific title is Ne Zha 魔童闹海, Ne Zha, the demon child who stirs up the sea. As I'm sitting down now, mid-March, this movie has already broken all kinds of records, including being the highest grossing movie ever in Chinese domestic market, including being the highest grossing animation film ever made in the world. And as its international release has started in March, the number is still slowly climbing. Right now, it's sitting at the 5th on the chart of the highest grossing movies ever globally, right under Titanic and above one of the two Infinity War movies. The total box office has already surpassed 15 billion RMB. And if you tell anybody 50 days ago this is gonna happen, no one would have believed you. Before the movie got released, the most optimistic estimation of its box office was done by the actual owner of the film studio that owns the studio that made the movie, Wang Changtian. And his prediction before the movie's release was 7 billion RMB. And when he said that, everybody in China laughed at him because the first movie back in 2019 summer in China performed 5 billion RMB, which was already the highest grossing animation. And people thought that's an impossible to surpass landmark. And 2024 had been a really bad year for Chinese cinema. Well, guess what? Be careful what you wish for, because now the movie's box office is officially more than twice of that most optimistic estimation. I guess it teaches us a lesson that you cannot always predict the future based on what you know about the world, because something else that has never happened could happen the next second. Now let's get to the real part of this video and why you probably clicked into this video. You probably want to know more about the character Ne Zha, and I am here to give you the information dump. I'm gonna break it down into multiple parts. You're gonna find the time code. I will first tell you about how to pronounce his name correctly in Chinese because it can be tricky. Second, I'll tell you as a mythological figure, and now most well known in China as a Taoism immortal, he actually came from very complicated and very long-winded background. Then I'll go into the literature and animation adaptation history of this character. Then finally, I'll be talking about my opinion about this character and why I think, even till today, he is so relevant and so popular. It ended up being this mythological character who broke all the records in the movie land. Now, let's first start with how to pronounce his name correctly. Ne, second tone, Zha, light tone. Chinese Mandarin characters have 4 plus 1 tone. We simplify that as first, second, third, fourth tone. As for the light tone, it is a character that does not have a tone. It gets dropped. The proper pronunciation of his name in Mandarin would be Ne Zha. Although, if you separate his name into two individual characters, the first character usually gets pronounced in Chinese as Na instead of Ne, and it means where or which one, depending on how you use it. And the second character, usually on its own, is pronounced with the first tone, zha. When it's used in Ne Zha's name, it becomes a light tone, and that happens with mainland Mandarin. If you're in other places, it could be pronounced slightly differently. In different Chinese dialect of different regions, his name gets pronounced in all sorts of imaginative and completely different ways. And this will have something to do with the fact that this is not a domestic Chinese name. It got imported from Sanskrit. Its origin is in ancient India. To give you an example, I come from Chongqing, which is the magical AD city, now is super popular on YouTube due to so many people have visited it and shot that light rail that goes through the building. This city is located in southwest of China and it has its own dialect. In Chongqing dialect, Ne Zha is properly pronounced as Na Zha. Just by saying that, I want to laugh because it's really weird. Even to Chongqing local people, the fact that the second character gets pronounced as zhua and then plus a erhua, which is the at the end, becomes zhuar, which usually does not happen to other words, even in Chongqing dialect. Now, this is just one example. In my local dialect, and if you go to other regions of China, he has completely different sounding names because the local dialect would incorporate it very differently. If you want to pronounce it properly and accurately with current standard Chinese Mandarin, Ne Zha is the name. Now, let's move to the second part of this video. You already know, I've told you, he comes from ancient India. The most condensed version I can give you about the origin of the character Ne Zha would be he initially was an ancient Indian immortal who existed before even the establishment of Hinduism. Then he got incorporated into Hinduism as a son of a very important god, more specifically, god of wealth. Then Buddhism took this god of wealth into its panel of heavenly beings and made him the northern cardinal direction heavenly king, also taking on the role of god of war. And Ne Zha is one of his sons. As Buddhism got imported into China, the god of the northern direction and god of war also got imported into China. And during Tang Dynasty, he was very popular. And it happens to be during Tang Dynasty, there was a real general, Li Jing, famous for winning so many battles and almost like a real life god of war. And this is a very common thing that happens in Chinese culture, which is a very famous person when he dies, the later comers started to worship and commemorate this person and make this person into an immortal. So this happened to this real general Li Jing. Later, people made him 托塔李天王, the Li heavenly king holding a pagoda. At this point, he becomes a Taoism god. He got mixed up with the Buddhism northern cardinal direction god of war. Therefore, his son, originally in Buddhism as one of the sons of the northern heavenly king, becomes 托塔李天王's son. In case you're wondering, what is Ne Zha's Hinduism god name? I cannot really do Sanskrit pronunciation, so I apologize in advance. Nalakuvara. And when Buddhism scriptures got translated into Chinese, initially he's written down as Na Zha Ju Fa Luo, phonetic translation of Nalakuvara. Although later he does get shortened, and that mostly happened during Song dynasty around 10th century. His name eventually got shortened to Ne Zha, adding a kou, which is mouth, on the left side of his first character, signifying he actually comes from a different culture, because a lot of Sanskrit names, when they get translated into ancient Chinese, people phonetically translate the names and they add kou, mouth, on the left side of the characters, signifying it is a phonetic translation. So Song dynasty people decided to shorten his name into two Chinese characters, and it becomes the written down version that we have now today as Ne Zha. Although probably Song dynasty people don't necessarily pronounce it in this way. As time goes on, we go into the very short-lived Yuan dynasty. During this time, there was a novel called So Shen Da Quan, literally means encyclopedia of searching for all the immortals. You will see the first version that made Ne Zha one of the three sons of the heavenly Li king who holds a pagoda. There you would find him as the youngest, where he has two brothers, Jin Zha and Mu Zha. And this is definitely a Chinese domestic creation, as these two brothers don't necessarily exist in the same way in Hinduism. It is supposedly that he has a brother, but just one, not two. So the Chinese version eventually decided he's gonna be the youngest in the family and created two brothers for him. Jin and Mu are metal or gold and wood, and they are the common elemental things of Chinese Taoism belief of the world's element. 5 of them: metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. And clearly, because Ne Zha existed first, so they named the two brothers in the same pattern, Zha, Zha, as the second character. But in the first character, they just picked characters from the elementals, so it becomes the metal and the wood, and then Ne Zha. Ne itself really doesn't have any meaning. As you know, it comes from a phonetic translation of Hinduism. Then Ming Dynasty comes around, which would be from the 14th to 16th century. And during this time, the story of 托塔李天王, the heavenly Li king, and his family got fully developed. We ended up with the novel, The Investiture of Gods, a very well-known Ming Dynasty fantasy novel using today's standard. In this novel, we have a very close to contemporary version of the character Ne Zha, where he has a full background, how he came to be, what kind of a kid he is, what kind of trials he went through, what kind of weapons he has, and what kind of powers he has. At this stage, he already has a mother, but the mother is not very important and she doesn't even have necessarily a name. It is during Ming Dynasty when opera singing got popular, and this character from this book got adapted into all forms of opera. People started to give him a full family and made up his mother as somebody called Lady Yin. And Yin is actually the royal surname of the Shang dynasty, where the investiture of gods the novel is set in, which is a very ancient dynasty. So you can say by 16th century, Chinese people have finally invented Ne Zha's background, his full panel of brothers and parents and all his story, and then they lumped them together and chucked them back in time into Shang dynasty. Although if you read the novel, the details of the world they describe is really completely based on the Ming Dynasty things. As he got incorporated into Taoism and becoming a very important Taoism immortal, he later had more and more roles. He is a type of marshal in the celestial court of the Taoism heaven and actually quite powerful. He has temples even today scattered around places in China, and there are a lot of people who still worship him. So this is the concise version of where Ne Zha comes from. A very interesting mythological character who has gone through so many stages of adaptation and change, and eventually consolidated and ended up being this rebellious child with a ribbon, with a loop, with two fiery wheels, and the spear. Now, let's go to the third part, talking about in the Ming Dynasty novel, what kind of character he really is and how he got adapted in the world of animation. It is widely acknowledged that no matter what you're writing about or creating content about or telling stories about, you're really talking about the time you are living in as the narrator, and you cannot run away from the particular time that you live in. And Ne Zha, in this sense, is a perfect example of during different times, he gets used as a different representation for different sets of values. If you look back in the original novel that created his background story in Ming Dynasty, he is very far away from an ideal child, let's say, or a beloved immortal. In that book, he's absolutely nasty, the most nasty, naughty type of children imaginable. He's extremely rude, he's extremely cruel. He goes around literally murdering other beings and without paying the prices and getting let off easily because he's supposedly the incarnation of a spiritual pearl who's destined for great things. It is not until that he made too much mess and created too much calamity and killed too many innocent beings that he has to pay the price. Otherwise, it's just not gonna fare well for his entire family. And his very unreasonable and nasty father, yes, in the book, the Tuota Li Tianwang is not a very nice father, basically forced his kid to commit suicide and making peace with all the other powerful beings that Ne Zha have made enemies with. After his death, because he's a magical being, he still in spiritual form told his mother to build temples for him so that he can get incense and worships and he can still do things. So the mother went behind the father's back and built him temples. And he got offerings for a while until the father discovered that and tried to destroy his temple. And then there was this big fight that broke out. And eventually, Ne Zha got reborn by having a new body made of lotus root by his teacher's magic. And he becomes then a proper god. He has the two wheels called Feng Huo Lun, wind fire wheels that helps him travel very fast. He has a loop in the current animation version is drawn as the golden thing that he wore around his neck when he was a little boy version. When he becomes big, he will wear it around his wrist. And that is called 天地无量乾坤圈, shortened as 乾坤圈, which is 乾 Yi Jing's version of heaven and Kun Yi Jing's word for earth. And Quan is just a loop. So that's a heaven and earth loop. Then he has a spear called 火尖枪, fire tip spear, his weapon clearly, and he has a ribbon. that always flows around him in red color called 魂天灵, which definitely gets overused by fan fictions in ways that is definitely not intended for its original use. Let's just put it that way. So if you know nothing about Ne Zha and you went straight into reading the Ming Dynasty novel, you're not gonna like him. He's written as this troublemaker who is so unreasonably favored and who did so many wrong things, and then somehow he still got away with it. Yet later, he becomes so much more popular and almost completely positive. And how did that happen? Here, we'll just focus on animation because in history, he does get written into all types of plays. There are also live action television series or even movies featuring this character. Since we're today talking about the 2025 explosive Ne Zha 3D movie, let's just focus on animation. And animation is still the most influential form of media that created the contemporary Ne Zha image in Chinese people's mind. First one will show up in 1961 in the animation 大闹天宫 Uproar in Celestial Palace or The Monkey King, depending on which translation you come across. It's an animation movie about, obviously, the Monkey King, 孙悟空, not about Ne Zha. And it was done by Shanghai Animation Film Studio. In that version, there was a sequence of 孙悟空, the Monkey King, fighting Ne Zha as a chubby 3-year-old baby with 3 heads and 6 arms, with his spears and his ribbons and his fiery wheel. 14 years later, in 1975, we got a definitive version of the 2D Ne Zha that even till today is still most people's mental image of Ne Zha. And that comes from another animation movie made that year called Ne Zha 闹海. Very similar to the current second movie of the 3D version, Ne Zha 魔童闹海. So only adding demon child. And in that version of the story, he has been turned into a completely positive character. He's the hero of the story, the center of the narrative. He's a child who has a strong sense of justice. He protects his friends and the people who live in Chentang Pass against bad dragons and killing the bad dragons. And because of that, he was forced to pay the price. And in this animation version, his dad, Pagoda Holding Heavenly King Li, is not a good guy. And the father is not on the son's side. And Ne Zha becomes the good child who is rebellious against patriarchy and unreasonable rules of the parents and injustice. And he killed himself, saying that this is paying back his flesh and blood that was given by his parents. Very classic sort of tragic story of parents and children, and you can trace that back to ancient history of plays and theater. The similar things with the original novel would be that he still dies and he still gets reborn with lotus root and becomes an immortal. Different thing would be he's a good child instead of the bad child. And thinking about 1970s, the particular political and cultural atmosphere in China, because he represents the revolutionary spirit against the established feudalism, patriarchy, the old traditions that need to be eradicated for the new generations to come. The whole, I kill myself, therefore I don't owe you anything, and then I can go on my way and do my things and build a new world spirit is very representative of the 1970s political and cultural mentality of China. And that Ne Zha was drawn as this really classic main character look animation character. It becomes the definitive version in animation world of what Ne Zha should look like to most Chinese people. After that, Ne Zha still got adapted in many different ways, such as the early 2000s CCTV long series of animation television episodic story, but there's a lot less conflict between the parents and child generation, and he's mostly the good kid throughout. And it's aimed at children, so you wouldn't have so much of an extreme dramatic conflict going on in that series. After that, the most major animation adaptation of Ne Zha character would be the current 2 movies we're talking about. The first movie that came out in 2019, the 3D version of Ne Zha, created by the Cacao Bean Studio by the director Jiaozi Dumpling, that is his artist name. And then 5.5 years later, the second movie. If you want to look at the current version of Ne Zha, you'll find it's really interesting that it combines the book version of the Nasty Kid and the 1970s and early 2000s version of the good kid. Mix them up together. Another big difference between the current 3D animation version Ne Zha and its previous iteration would be they created a counterpart for him. He used to be the only main character in his story. Ne Zha is just Ne Zha. Whereas this time, Ne Zha is the demon pearl, where he has a counterpart that originally they are the same thing. The good spirit pearl, represented by the Dragon King's son, Ao Bing. This is the bad dragon that gets killed in the 1970s version by Ne Zha, and then just a dragon who got killed in the original novel. He's not the second main character, he's not the counterpart, he's just one supporting role. Yet this time, they decided 自古红蓝出 CP. If you have red and you have blue, they naturally are a CP. So they gave Ne Zha the demon nature and the red color, and they gave Ao Bing, the Dragon King's son, another little dragon, the blue color and the good part. And when they come together in the second movie for a period of time, because both of their spirits live in Ne Zha's body for a part of the movie, when Ao Bing takes control over Ne Zha's body, his face will turn into this really pretty kid version of Ne Zha that is based on the 1970s animation. Looking at these two pictures, you know clearly where it comes from. And even within the movie itself, his teacher, Tai Zhenren, when he looked at the Ao Bing version of Ne Zha, he would be saying, oh, this one looks like the real version, the real thing, instead of a knockoff. Intertextuality between Ne Zha's different versions. And then there is another big difference between the novel version of Ne Zha and then the current 3D animation version, which is in the 3D animation version, he's got actually a really good family, a very loving mother, very loving dad, the best parents you can ever hope for. And that kind of helped him to not completely fallen into his destiny as the demon child, and he becomes a good child because he was actually raised in a family with love. In the second movie, at the end of it, you eventually see other two brothers, although they really don't have plot in these two movies and we don't know their stories, but they kept novel version of his family background, having two older brothers and then two parents. But this time he's lucky because he's got two very good parents. So these are the essential differences in character setup. And a lot of people argue why that is the case. It is maybe mostly due to the fact that the director, Dumpling, he actually grew up in a family with a lot of love. He's supported by his mother unconditionally for years so that he could do animation when he had no income. And without the family support, he would not ever be able to achieve what he has achieved today. That may get reflected in his writing and in his way of thinking about parents and children's relationship. So this is the literature and animation adaptation history of Ne Zha, the character. And I think Ne Zha is the perfect example. Again, proving the point that every animation, film, literature creation is ultimately the creation of its own time. Then let's talk about the last point, my thoughts on Ne Zha. Not specifically about the success of the second movie or necessarily about movie narratives, and that needs its own video, but my ideas and my thinking about why this movie got this popular in 2025. A lot of that will come down to, first, Chinese people have this innate love for highly rebellious characters. And the second would be, it coincides with too many things ongoing outside of the movie's own control, such as geopolitics, and you can even count in the TikTok refugee situation at the beginning of this year or at the end of the last year, the supersonic whatever missiles China put out, and then you have DeepSeek running into the whole thing. The world happens to just give so many signs and so many things that in a way is representing, we can fairly say, the rise of China. And Ne Zha, particularly the second movie, happens to have the message of the injustice of the existing system that categorizes people, classifies people, and lock them in their classes, brainwash and gaslighting them into believing the system is justice and you should work towards building the system and even yield your power to it. Whereas Ne Zha wakes up from that and realizes, who cares if I'm demon or immortal or God in your words. I know my own value, and if there's injustice, I'm just gonna fight till the end of the world and destroy it and build the new world. So that energy is just happening very in sync with what's going on in the world. That's one huge reason of why it got so big in China. But coming back to the first point, when I said Chinese people have this innate love for extremely highly rebellious character, and that is no joke. And if you're not familiar with Chinese culture, you may get really surprised by that. Because China is a country that has such a long history, and it had so many dynasties with imperial rulings, with one name, one family controlling supposedly the whole kingdom, although in practice it does not necessarily work like that. It would be weird to think about Chinese people's cultural identity is so deeply tied with being rebellious. But the fact is, Chinese people have always been very rebellious, and it becomes a very deeply ingrained belief, let's say, in the collective subconsciousness of the nation. Because no matter who is sitting on the throne, Chinese people always believe fundamentally 王侯将相宁有种乎, very famous line. And if you learn Chinese, you definitely come across these two lines. The people who ended up being generals or kings, they're not necessarily better intrinsically than us, than our commoners. They don't have better breeds than we have. If they don't do what they're supposed to do, if they're sitting on the throne and yet not taking the responsibilities of being, in a way, parenting the country well, then it is people's rights and we should overthrow them. Now, you can argue that over the thousands of years of history, it always ended up being still the imperial power, still the one person or one family ruling over everything. It's just repeating it in cycles. But the fact that Chinese people really don't believe fundamentally that anybody is innately better than others, and everyone has the right to overthrow the previous one if they're not good enough, is already a lot more, let's say, progressive than many other places in the world where even till today, people still deeply believe in the superiority of bloodline. In all the countries that still have basically aristocrats, you can put it that way. That actually has long been phased out in Chinese culture. Surprisingly, thousands of years ago, Chinese people kind of have stopped believing in that. So it's one really interesting aspect of Chinese culture. Therefore, when you think about that nature of how in Chinese real history, dynasties replace the previous one by doing this, and as long as they have the so-called justifiable war overthrowing the previous undeserving ruler, then they are legitimate rulers. For later history people to look back on them and saying they own the right to then rule that period of time. So this is a very deeply ingrained concept in Chinese people's mentality. Therefore, it's really easy to understand why these super powerful beings who are rebellious in nature and who have, at some stage of their lore, gone against the established rule. In this case, in mythological world, the celestial palace are the most popular mythological characters. So Ne Zha is one of the three most popular mythological characters, and we call them 天庭三大反骨仔, celestial palaces, three big rebels. And they are Ne Zha, the Monkey King, Sun Wukong, and Yang Jian, 二郎, immortal. The three of them come from three very different backgrounds. And they each represent, I'd say, a way of going against the rule of the established power. And even between them, they've got wars and fights, and it's hard to say who comes out on top. And they have very deeply intertwined and complicated story, whether it's ancient novels or mythological lores or even in contemporary adaptation. Whatever they do and however they differ from each other, they are three well-recognized symbols of when there's injustice, when there's unfairness, they come out with their spear, and with their staff, beating down all the things in their way. And in a way, I find it's just really entertaining to see August last year, the game got released, and it's a regeneration of these two characters in Chinese mythology, and immediately half a year later, in that we have Ne Zha being regenerated again, and everything really in this case feels so much scripted. At the end of this video, I will thank you again for sitting through this long video with me. Hope this has been useful and entertaining. If you haven't seen the movie yet, the first movie I think is free on YouTube in certain regions, so it's pretty easy to get hold of. Then, if you can get to a theater to watch the second movie, please do, because this is one of those animations that definitely deserves a big screen. And the bigger, the merrier. If you have IMAX, definitely go for IMAX. And I would say actually 2D IMAX will look better than 3D because 3D tends to get a little bit dimmer and you wouldn't be able to see as many details as possible. Thank you for watching Avenue X. I'll see you in my next video. Meanwhile, live long and happy animation watching.